we'll finish up half chapter 13, then Friday will be the last meeting. Friday we'll finish up the rest of chapter 13. Then I'll add some remarks about your future. What comes after this textbook in terms of IR. So you finish the whole book, right? You finish the whole book, you cover 13 different topics in IR. Broadly speaking, IR. Now you know IR, how IR is divided. Theories, IR theories. So I'll talk about this a little bit on Friday, but IR theories. Then you have war and conflicts, right? War and conflict, security studies. Then you have UN studies or global governance, UN or global governance. Then you have IPE. Under IPE, global finance, global trade, climate change, or energy, right? Then development. All these smaller topics come under the rubric of IPE. So that's how IR is divided. So after this class, as you move on to upper level courses, you would take individual courses that handle these individual topics. Unfortunately, we don't have IR theories class in our curriculum. We don't have IR theories, but we have the UN, international organizations, we have war and conflicts, and we have IPE. IPE will come up in the junior year, which I'm going to be teaching IPE. Then we have, in the senior year, we have separate climate change energy class, which I'm going to be teaching in the senior year. So that's how separate topics will come up as you go up, right? Now, 13, international development. Here, again, new topic. It's a huge field. It's a really broad field. The main thing about this topic, international development, is how economic development occurs in different developing countries. That's the main thing. How economic development occurs in different developing countries. So the main theme here is economic, probably not, development itself. What is development? Right? What is development? When and how development occurs. Right? Development, there are two sides. Economic development, political development. Economic development, political development. And economic development, political development, they are connected. They are connected. But this textbook begins with the definition. With the definition of economic development. Because, this textbook addresses the economic side of development rather than political side of development. That's the focus of this textbook. They don't address how economic development is mixed up with political development. This textbook doesn't address that. So it's simply the focus is on economic side of development. Okay, so this textbook begins with the definition of economic development. What is economic development? Economic side of development. It's worthwhile to remember this definition. It's a functional definition of economic development. The second line, the first page. Economic development refers to the combined processes. There are several components. There are several components that combine to define economic development. These several components are, number one, the most important component of economic development is capital accumulation. To develop, you first have to accumulate capital, money, seed money, right? So most important thing about economic development first is capital accumulation. Then per capita income increase, rising per capita incomes. Then third, skills in the population. Then technology. This is the definition for him. So number one, economic development, you must have money, capital. Second, some income level must be guaranteed for people. Then people must acquire some skills. Then finally, technology. Technology. All these combine to define economic development. This is not an exhaustive definition, but these are basic to economic development. But last but not least, other related social and economic changes. Other related social economic changes. What other related social economic changes? Maybe social changes. When economies grow, right? When economies grow, there must be some related social changes that come with these economic development, right? When your economies grow, what social changes you can expect? Maybe middle classes rise, right? The rise of middle class, that must be part of the social changes. And rise of the status of women. As economies grow, the status of women in society grow, right? Those are social changes that come with economic development. And increase in political demands. When economies grow, like North Korea, okay? North Koreans, they don't have any consciousness about politics, okay? They have just simple, basic human needs, food, right? Things like that. They don't ask for any political demands, North Koreans. But when economies grow, when North Koreans get richer and richer, they might ask for some political demands, right? That is common to any society, okay? So these are related social economic changes. So let me emphasize this again. The most central aspect of economic development is what? The most central aspect of economic development is rise in people's income? No. No. Is it rise in middle class? No. Is it technological change? No. That is capital accumulation. Okay? The most important central aspect of economic development is capital accumulation. Next, the most important measure of economic development is what? GDP per capita. Okay? Most important measure for economic development is GDP per capita, which is shown figure 13.1, page 462. Okay? The most important measure of economic development is GDP per capita. Put differently, this chapter is about success and failures of the global south. Okay, success and failures. There have been ups and downs. Okay, there have been ups and downs in the global south. Some countries succeed, others fail. Right? Some developing countries in the global south, they are more successful than others. What we have to do as an analyst, as a student of international relations, is we have to ask why some countries are more successful than others. That's what we have to do. Why some countries are more successful than others in the global south. They are in the same global south. But why some developing countries are more successful than others? Right? That's the question. That's the question. Is there any pattern? Is there any common analytical pattern, okay, through which we can diagnose these successes and failures of developing countries? And this textbook, in fact, provides three most important principles. Three most important principles for economic development. What are these three most important principles? What are three most important principles through which we can diagnose success or predict successes and failures? Any volunteer who want to talk about this, discuss this? What are three important principles? General principles for economic development. Lessons. This textbook provides three different groups of developing countries. Okay? This textbook provides three different groups of developing countries that come in different time periods. Right? Different time periods. There are three groups, and they come in different as sort of a waves. The first group that experimented with this economic development, the first group was NICs, newly industrializing countries. NICs, newly industrializing countries. Those are the first group. Who are these newly industrializing countries? In other words, NICS, newly industrializing countries, or differently called four tigers or four dragons. Who are these countries? Number one, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. These are four dragons. These are the first group. These are the first experimentation group, which turned out to be hugely successful. Okay? Most successful group. Most successful group. The second group. Who are the second group? China, India. China, India. These are the second group. Okay? Different time periods, but Korea came first. NICS came first. Then China, India follow. Okay? After China, India, who are the third group? The third group, which are composed of very different groups of countries. Okay? The third group, again, different categories. Third group, different categories. But most important countries, Indonesia. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey. These are most important countries. Okay? The third group, these are third group. Rising developing countries after Korea, China, India. And this textbook moves on to describe, in the initial several pages, moves on to describe what happened to different groups of developing countries, right? How and why Ford wagons turned out to be successful. What's the success? What's the key to the success of China? Okay, what's the key to the success of India? That's how this textbook sort of discusses. Then later, they discuss the remaining group of countries, the third group. Okay, whole bunch of hodgepodge of remaining developing countries. Some of them are still ongoing, right? So these three groups. Then, having laid out these three different groups of developing countries, this textbook come out to some general principles of economic development, page 472. These are the lessons. Having looked at different developing countries, these are the lessons. These are key to the success of developing countries. So sort of this is the list of guidelines, so to speak. Guidelines for those who want to be rich. These are the guidelines, or lessons, or manual. Manual. This is a manual. Manual for those, poor developing countries who want to be successful. This is the manual or guidelines. What are three essential things for economic development? Let's discuss this first. Then why don't you apply these general principles to each different groups of countries, cases. That's how we proceed today. So we begin with some general principles first. Okay? So this is kind of a interesting exercise because there are two ways of studying IR. One is to begin with cases, empirical examples. Okay? And having looked at these empirical examples, then look at or reach some conclusion, right? Extract some principles from these different cases. What is this type of study? This type of study, beginning with cases, examples, then reaching out to some principles. This sort of a study is called inductive method. Inductive method. From examples to some conclusion, principles. The other way, from principles first, abstract theories, principles, then reach examples. This is deductive method. Okay? Now we'll go the other way around. So we'll begin with some general principles first, beginning page 472, then go backward to check with real cases. Now, there are three essential things to economic development. Let me lay out these three principles first, then elaborate on each of these. First, all these successful developing countries, they have three essential components. for economic development. Number one, all of them adopted so-called import substitution and export-led growth. This is number one, import substitution and export-led growth. That's number one principle. In other words, as a developing country, as a poor country, in order to succeed, okay, in order to succeed, you must export. Okay, you must export. That's the highway to economic growth. You must export and you must cut import. That's number one principle. You must cut import, so-called import substitution. Okay? Import is a bad thing. Import is a bad thing. Export is a good thing for economic development. At least for starters, you must export. That's important for capital accumulation. Capital accumulation, you remember that, right? Most central aspect of economic development is capital accumulation. For capital accumulation, you must export, not import. You must export. This is number one principle. Second, to develop economically, you must emphasize or you must prioritize in terms of industries. I mentioned this in the previous class. There are two kinds of developing countries. There are developing countries that specialize in manufacturing industries, okay? And the second group of developing countries specializes in raw materials. Okay, there are two kinds of developing countries. Scholars tend to agree that manufacturing-oriented developing countries grow much better than raw materials-based developing countries. Again, the second principle suggests that to economically grow, you must rely on manufacturing, not raw materials. Not raw materials. That's number two principle, not raw materials. Okay? Not raw materials. Manufacturing is important, then raw materials, exports. But the question is, if you look around more than 100 different developing countries, many of developing countries, particularly those who are poor, many of developing countries don't have basis for manufacturing, right? What they have is something underground, right? So many developing countries, majority of them are actually specializing in raw materials, including agriculture. So the lesson for economic development is you must suppress raw materials dependence, then jump to the manufacturing stage. That's the second lesson. But how do you do that? That's a difficult question. How do we jump from raw materials dependence to manufacturing production, particularly for, right, low-level developing countries? This is a very difficult task, but you must do it. Those who were successful did this somehow. They passed the stage of raw materials, then jumped to the manufacturing stage. This is the second principle. The third principle, in order to develop economically, you must contain corruption. You must contain corruption. Corruption hinders economic development. So those who were successful were most successful in this respect: corruption control. So these are number three principle: corruption. Let's look at one by one. First, number one principle. Principle one: import substitution, export-led growth. Import substitution and export-led growth this emphasizes the importance of trade. Okay, for us, trade is important. And again, to accumulate capital, right, you must trade. And in so doing, you create trade surplus. Okay, what is important? Trade surplus. Right? Then using that trade surplus, you build industry and infrastructure. Okay? Let me give you the definition of import substitution. Import substitution, the second line here, page 473, the definition is this: the development of local industries. You want to develop your own industries first, okay? The development of local industries to produce items that a country had been importing, right? You develop your own industries, okay, so that you cut down on imports. That's import substitution. But import substitution, to do that, you must give some subsidies and some special treatment to your own industry. You must protect your own industries, right? By giving subsidies, state subsidies, support, and tariff protection. That's how you grow your own industries. This might sound odd a little bit, because this goes against the principle of free trade, right? This goes against the principle of comparative advantage, right? The Western economics textbook says otherwise, right? The Western textbook says that to develop economically, you must, right, follow the principles of comparative advantage, right? You must follow the comparative advantage. So import substitution goes against the principle of comparative advantage. But in fact, those who were successful in economic development, they resorted to this unorthodox, okay, non-Western type of economic strategy, which is import substitution and export-led growth, right? So what they export is manufactured goods, okay, then raw materials. Okay, they don't export raw materials, they export manufactured goods. Now, the room temperature is going high, right? A lot of you, looks like you're sleeping. So do you agree? Most of developing countries, successful ones particularly, they resorted to this economic strategy, exporting manufactured goods, right? Look at the example of Korea. Let's discuss a little bit the Korean example, or Nick's example, right? Nick's example. How Korea became successful several, maybe, right, depending on when you talk about, maybe 3 decades ago, how Korea became successful at an earlier stage of economic development. Why Korea became successful, right? Korea didn't have any raw materials, which turned out to be a blessing. I think if Korea had a lot of oil and gas underground, I don't think Korea, would have taken the road what we took, right? If we had had a lot of raw materials on the ground. So clearly, Koreans lacked raw materials. What we had was, I mentioned this before, what we had instead was people's talent, right? People's talent. We had a lot of, young, ambitious labor force, right? That's what we had. We rely on that, right? And using that, we resorted to this strategy, import substitution, right? And what industries we Koreans first developed first? Heavy industries, heavy manufactured goods, right? Heavy manufactured goods, like a coal, steel industry, right? POSCO, right? Steel industry, that's what we were good at. And petrochemical, right? Steel industry, petrochemical industries, that's what we were good at at the initial stage. So South Korea developed competitive steel and automobile industries, right, later, right? Heavy industries, petrochemical, raw material, automobile industries, right? And we exported these heavy manufactured goods, and we created trade surplus, right? Then we built roads, right? The infrastructure, basic infrastructure. Taiwan, how about Taiwan? Taiwan was different from Korea, different than Korea. Taiwan specialized in the electronics and computer industries in the beginning, okay? So Taiwan was more of a light manufactured industries, okay? Light manufacturing. Hong Kong, same. Hong Kong electronics and other light industries, okay? And plus Hong Kong banking, right? And in my opinion, I think these 3 principles are all right, but these principles don't exhaustively explain the success of Korea, at least. You're right. I mean, we Koreans, right? Our strategy was import substitution. Yes, we protected our inchoate industries, right? We didn't abide by global free trade principles because we protected our own industry by giving unfair subsidies and tariff protection, right? There's no other way. They're all right, okay? They're all right. Our strategy was import substitution and export-led. That's how we accumulated capital, right? That's how we earned money, particularly 2 big Jabil corporations in the 70s, Hyundai, Samsung, right? Hyundai, Samsung, they're heavily protected by the government, right? Heavily protected by the government. Right? We relied on manufacturing, right? We emphasized manufacturing, it is right. But there are several other key things that we were good at, or we were different, and which this textbook doesn't mention enough, doesn't emphasize enough. Because Korean strategy, it was manufacturing, it was import substitution, but more than anything else, Korean economic development strategy was, more than anything else, state planned, government planned, right? It's not market principle, okay? Government plan. And these companies are almost half government control. Jabil companies, Samsung, Hyundai, right? So there is no clear dividing line between, corporations and government, right? It's a mixture of half government, half private. I think we should emphasize that as a key Korean economic development strategy. Banking is important because when these Jabil corporations grew at the first stage, they used a lot of loans from banks, right? They used a lot of loans from banks. But these banks, Korean banks, when they lend money to these Jabil corporations, Hyundai and Samsung, they give it because they were ordered to give these loans to these companies by the government, right? A lot of money, a lot of government money was just given to these Jabil corporations, not because their projects, business plans were good, but because the government ordered these banks to give these loans to these companies, right? That's how these Jabil corporations grew, right? This is important. This is part of half private, half government economic strategy. I think this strategy is very efficient and successful and tried in many Asian countries. This is part of Asian business culture, not only in Korean, right, but also in Japan. But this sort of a half private, half government economic strategy later become a problem, right? When IMF and Western standards arrive in Korea, right? This turned out to be a huge problem for the Korean economy, right? That's how Jabil corporations go bankrupt, right? In the 2000s. So initially it was efficient, successful, but when Western standards are introduced, this kind of strategy become a huge problem for the Korean economy. Right? But initially, very successful. This Jabil type of management of these corporations. So I want to emphasize that as part of successful strategies. How about China? China in terms of industries. How about China and India? How China began to grow is a really long story, right? From communist turned growing successful market economy. That's China. That's Chinese economy, and it has a long story. But to make a long story short, the beginning of Chinese economic development. Do you know when is the real beginning of Chinese economic success? The real beginning of Chinese economic success. It's a long, long time ago. When is the real beginning of Chinese economic success?
After introducing Great Leap program
Hmm.
in China.
Who? Under whom?
Mao Zedong, I think.
Deng Xiaoping. Right. There was a leader behind Chinese economic success. Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, came in, emerged as a new leader. Then he introduced market-type economic reform program. Right? Then 1979, it is written here, 1979, right? Deng Xiaoping instituted market economic reforms. Okay? Did he transform the entire China, or he began with a certain part of China? He didn't introduce full-scale economic reform, right? He introduced first partial economic reform that applies to only part of China, southern part of China, coastal area, right? That's why Deng Xiaoping was so smart, leaving inner and northern, area intact. Then he opened up the southern coastal area first to foreign investment. So Chinese strategy is to open up southern coastal area for foreign investment. And that's how he accumulated capital. That's Chinese capital accumulation, right? Southern coastal area open as free economic zone. That's the beginning of Chinese economic success. That's how China accumulated capital, right? This textbook doesn't discuss the example of Russia, right? Russia is the opposite example. The opposite example. China succeeded and proceeded at a very stable pace since then. Then Russia was in disarray. Russia was in shambles. Particularly after the Soviet breakup, they parted really this way, right? Same communist country, they were under the same communist ideology, but the way they proceeded after 1990 was so different. So we wonder why China was successful and why Russia was unsuccessful. Right? There was a lot of discussion, but no clear answer, right? Very different, two examples. So the southern coastal area as free economic zones, that is important. And let me quote the amount of foreign investment for China. As of 2000, the amount of foreign investment into China was $250 billion. And as of 2009, $1.1 trillion into China. So because of this foreign investment, China was sort of enjoying rapid economic growth. For consecutive more than 10 years, right, over 10% economic growth rate annually. Then India takes off. Again, India was under the communist ideology. The best friend of India was the Soviet Union, right? The close economic partner was the Soviet Union. So India, after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, India was thrown into a severe economic crisis, right? Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They lost the foremost economic partner. Then India began to change by introducing some Western economic rules, then began to grow between 1996 2008, right? Sort of a promoted as a second China, right? Promoted as a second China. Again, India, again, their economic strategy was to specialize in a particular industry. But if Korea was in heavy industry, and Hong Kong, Singapore, light industries, but India was in specializing in service and information technology industries. That's what India was specializing in, right? Service and information technology industries. The service sector accounts for 30%. Okay? Particularly, India was specializing in exporting software and telephone call center services. That's what India is known for. So far, we are still on, export-led growth, and we are discussing Korean example, then Chinese example, then Indian example. But initial capital accumulation and import substitution, conclusion is that the initial import substitution strategies for many countries were successful. Okay, but in many countries, including Korea, to sustain economic development is another matter, right? Many developing countries, even those who were successful later, encountered a lot of economic problems, including Korea, and chaebol corporations that were, later turned out to be, a lot of problems. Particularly after the 1997 IMF crisis, all these problems that these, developing countries had sort of a surface, right? So still Korea, I'm not talking about the level of per capita income, but we still have a lot of problems. I think for our economic growth to be sustainable, we need to resolve a lot of remaining problems. Particularly those, there are many problems, but particularly welfare problem. Still, we have so many, poor people that are not covered by, government programs. Right? So we have that problem, and Samsung, Hyundai, those are good companies. Okay, those are good companies, but we need more better companies than Samsung, Hyundai. In other words, we need to diversify our economies, right? To include not simply semiconductor industry, but not simply automobile companies, but we need more future type of economic engine for future Korean economy. We haven't discovered those industries yet, right? So that's an issue for the Korean economy. And China again, hugely successful in the beginning, right? But Chinese economic growth rate is slowing down. It's slowing down. They weathered the financial crisis, 2008, 2009 financial crisis. They got around that problem, but China again is in the middle of a lot of remaining bigger problems. So that's China. India is rapidly catching up. India is kind of a China in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So India still has much room to grow. I think what I want to discuss in the remaining time is that the second thing, the page 473, the manufacturing and corruption, these are related. If you read these two general principles, in other words, concentrate on manufacturing, then avoid corruption, these two principles. My question is, if you read this, why developing countries, they have to concentrate on manufacturing to economically grow? The reason being that there are a lot of risks if you depend on raw materials exports. There are a lot of risks, right? And raw materials dependence, another problem with that is the raw material dependence is susceptible to corruption. I think this is important. Corruption is much more likely in the raw materials specialization. I want to discuss a little bit this problem. In other words, why raw materials dependence? Okay, why raw materials dependence hinders economic development? We used the term in the previous class, resource curse, right? If you rely on raw materials production, right, the resource curse, you will catch the Dutch disease or resource curse, right? Why resource abundance is a curse rather than blessing? That's the question. Why resource abundance is a curse, and why manufacturing production is a blessing, right? Then, what about those countries that are abundant in raw materials? Like Russia. Russia is abundant natural resource holder, right? Then how should Russia take advantage of these abundant natural resources, raw materials? Could Russia smoothly make a transition from raw materials production to manufacturing production? Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, those four big dragons, this is out of the question because these four dragons, from the beginning, from the perspective of endowment, they simply lack raw materials, right? So they never make a transition from raw materials to manufacturing, right? They must begin with manufacturing, no doubt. But what about those countries, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, or Iraq, Qatar, Afghanistan? There are so many different, or many African countries. How should how should these African, Middle Eastern countries, right, those who are abundant natural resource holders, how should they develop? Right? They're different from Korea, different from Singapore, Taiwan. Right? How economic development occurs for these countries, that's, I think, really, really difficult policy and analytical questions. Because manufacturing must come after resource production for these countries. So somehow they have to utilize raw materials first, then accumulate capital, right? Then enter the manufacturing stage. Right? And you need to ask why the second principle here, why manufacturing is the royal road to economic development. Why they keep mentioning this is that they saw a lot of problems in raw materials countries. So these non-natural resource abundant countries, they are lucky because they simply didn't have it. Okay, they are blessed with manufacturing base first from the very beginning. And that's how development literature sort of discuss this issue, right? Sort of they are biased against raw material countries. But the real question is then how economic development comes to these raw material countries. This textbook doesn't discuss that, right? This textbook doesn't discuss because there are so many countries in that category. There are so many countries in that category. Most African countries and most Middle Eastern countries, they are in that category, including Russia. Why Russia, China? They sort of took different roles because this natural endowment was different. Russia was a raw material based country. Okay? Deng Xiaoping, he took the road of economic reform because they didn't have any natural resource endowment they could rely on. So China, the leader, Deng Xiaoping, he resorted to foreign investors instead. And Putin and Russian president, they resorted to raw materials. It's a very different basis. And the outcome, China, successful. Russia is a huge fiasco, historic fiasco. That's the outcome for Russia. So, let me talk a little bit about why natural resource specialization is a problem. So-called the resource curse. Here's the problem. Number one, economic resource curse. This is economic resource curse. Let me talk a little bit about that. Economic resource curse. What is economic resource curse? Economic resource curse is differently called Dutch disease. Dutch disease. Maybe the lady from the Netherlands, you know better than I do, right? The Dutch disease. Economic resource curse was discovered by the Dutch. Okay, in the 1960s or early 1970s. Okay, economic resource curse, which is, this is it. The more resource you have, the lower economic growth rate. Okay, that's economic resource curse. The reason is, if you rely on raw materials export, okay, there's a chain effect. If you rely on raw materials export, okay, you export raw materials, and you have flow of dollar revenues, okay, flow of dollar revenues, additional dollar incomes from raw materials export. Then you have appreciation of your currency, okay, appreciation of your currency. Then if your currency appreciates, then what happens is first, non-resource industries, they die. Non-resource industries die because if your currency appreciates, okay, you lose competitiveness. So only resource exports remain and other industries sort of die. That's how the more resources you have, your economic growth rate low. The lower your economic growth rate. That's economic resource curves. Political resource curves. Okay, resource abundance is also politically politically counterproductive, because resource abundance, this is what this textbook says. Okay, page 475. Page 475. Eight from the bottom. 8 from the bottom. Okay, let me read this to you. Developing countries dependent on exporting a few products. Okay, developing countries dependent on exporting a few products, particularly raw materials. Okay, particularly raw materials. The revenue arrives in a very concentrated form. The revenue arrives in a very concentrated form. Large payments in hard currency. In most cases, in dollars. Presenting a greater opportunity for corruption than in a more diversified economy. This is political resource curves. Corruption is much higher in raw material dependent countries. This is a major element in the resource curves. Okay? So you might wonder, Saudi Arabia, you name it. I mean, those who are in the OPEC, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, those countries, they earn a lot of money, right? The revenue income for oil and gas exports. Russia, another example. Russia earns a lot of money by exporting oil and gas, both oil and gas. But look at their per capita income, right? They've done this export for so many years, for decades. But after decades of oil and gas exports, the outcome for economic growth, economic development is so underperforming, so disappointing. The reason is because of economic resource curves and because of political resource curves, corruption. The money doesn't come down to people, the real economy. The money stays higher up, those high-ranking people. The money goes there, not trickling down to the real population. So the entire economy doesn't grow because of corruption. Okay? Because of corruption, because of that economic resource curse problem. That's what the Netherlands found out briefly in the late 60s. The Netherlands found out a huge deposit of natural gas in the North Sea, right? Then they began to export this natural resource, the natural gas, to European members, right? Briefly. Then after several years of exports of natural gas, Netherlands found out that their economic growth rate is going down. Right? What a paradox. They have more money, but the economic growth rate going down. This is Dutch disease. Because the Netherlands, the Dutch economy at that time was caught with disease of raw materials. So the more you export natural resources, the general effect on the economy is worse. That's Dutch disease. Right? Now, let me add one more. Why raw material exporters are underachievers than manufacturing exporters. So economic resource curse, political resource curse. Another problem with raw material exporters is look at the international markets for raw materials. Okay? International market for oil, international market for natural gas, or international market for rubber, or international market for any type of raw materials like iron ore or steel. Look at the market. Or copper. Chile. Chile is known for copper exports. Okay? Chile is not a diversified economy. Chile is specializing in copper exports. Okay? Majority of exports come from Chile. Now, again, the international market for copper is same. The nature of international raw materials market is it stable or unstable? Like for instance, market for automobiles. Hyundai. Our Korean economy is not dependent on Hyundai, but we export a lot of cars. We export a lot of cars, we export a lot of semiconductor products. And maybe if you combine these two, maybe more than 50% of the Korean economy income source comes from these two industries. So Korean economy is not sound enough, is not diversified enough. So when these two industries, semiconductor and automobile industry, when these two industries are depressed, the income for Korea must, right, be much smaller, which is a risk for the Korean economy. That's why diversification is important. But the market for automobiles, the market for semiconductor is not that unstable. Price, more or less, right, within some range. We can expect some range, right? There is no, drastic ups and down, at least. But raw materials market is different. Raw materials market by nature is very unstable, fluctuating. So another reason why raw materials exporters are underachievers, probably the most important reason is fluctuation in prices. International raw material prices fluctuations. Oil price, best example. Oil price, best example. Highly fluctuating. Oil prices are highly fluctuating. right? Which means the incomes for oil exporters are also highly fluctuating, right? There are boom times and bust times. For several years, you earn money, then you lose in the following years. So Saudi, yes, I mean they earned a lot of money, but Saudi economy is like this. For several decades, Saudi economy, there's ups and downs. So if you average out, right, the income source for the entire population, almost the same. That's the problem for raw material countries. So that's why you must diversify. You must diversify. You must pass this raw material stage to manufacturing stage. That's diversification. Diversification. That's number 2 principle. That's number 2 principle. And number 3 principle at the same time. Yes. Most of my research is on these issues. Resource curse, right? But if you look into these issues, you are surprised by the fact that there are so many countries in that category today. There are so many developing countries in this category. So this is a real global issue. This is a poverty reduction issue also. To reduce poverty, you need to take care of this resource issue, because there are so many developing countries. They are resource sort of dependent countries. So, page 476. Because this issue is so important, some NGOs, they are promoting the idea of we have raw materials coming out. There's so much energy is being wasted here, right? So here, page 476, what's important here is to make sure that these resource export revenues, okay, to help relieve the resource curse in so many developing countries. What's important is to make sure that the revenues for resource exports must flow into the general population. That's important. So transparency. So how do we guarantee transparency in these resource exporting countries? Some NGOs, they push for some action to stem corruption in resource dependent countries. What is this movement called? This movement called Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It's a little bit complex name. Extractive Industries Transparency EITI. EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. The idea behind this is poverty and corruption in many resource exports countries, okay, comes from non-transparency in using oil revenues. So a coalition of governments, NGOs, and companies, oil majors, a coalition of governments, NGOs, and oil majors, they launched this initiative 2002. Okay, the idea behind this is to collect all the information about the flow of revenues about resource export countries, so that the governments cannot lie about their revenue incomes about oil exports. Okay, which is very important movement. Okay, so this was launched 2002, and it's a fight against corruption. Okay, in the oil and gas and mineral sectors. So they get companies to release information on payments they make to developing countries. Right? So the members, there must be some members. Not all the oil exporting countries. There are dozens of oil exporting members are members of this EITI initiative. And once they become members, they must release information to this organization. Now, which shows that there must be a lot of under the table, dealings between Western oil companies and these oil exporting countries, bureaucrats, right? Side payments, bribes, right? So if you become a member, those irregular activities cannot be done anymore. Right? Okay. Then I think foreign investment and foreign assistance, ODA, these issues on Friday. Okay? I'll see you on Friday, 2 o'clock. And 2 o'clock, maybe lecture only an hour, then probably additional half an hour for closing remarks. Okay? Then the exam on Tuesday. That's the end of this semester.